Yeah, so just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I'm a medical doctor by education, but I love to build and break things. So I'm an entrepreneur by heart. I have started companies, but right now I'm at Dell Medical School. And my job is that I am an evangelist for innovation, but it has to meet those three criteria. So the three criteria that I use: impact, which is basically how significant is the impact of the innovation, right? The second part is the ingenuity, which is the novelty, because obviously if many people have done it before, there's nothing new about it, there's nothing path breaking about it, then yeah, I'm not very excited about it. And the last part is the intensity, which for me is a human thing, right? It's about the team. It's how excited and passionate they are and about solving the problem, not about the technology. And to be honest, I stole this from a framework. So much for ingenuity from my side. So I'm a huge advocate for pricing transparency, for consumer empowerment, things like that, which obviously make healthcare costs go down. So any way to compare different prices and do comparison shopping, I'm all for that. So that's what I frequently, when I post on social media, that's what I'm writing about because I'm very passionate about that. But we are nowhere close to that. And we will talk about that today a little bit. I do have strong opinions on which innovations create impact. We hear about a lot of exciting things, but yes, I am pretty opinionated about which ones I would support. I also advise a few health tech and medtech companies, and we'll come to the differences very soon. And I have dabbled pretty much in every sector in healthcare. So I have worked on drugs, diagnostics, devices, surgical tools, wearables, digital health. So pretty much like everything in healthcare. And I do teach a couple of classes at UT Austin because I think that the next generation is much smarter than us and they seem to know everything. If you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. So just hand off our problems to them and hopefully they'll solve them because healthcare has huge problems. So I'm a skeptic and optimist at the same time. So how is that possible? So I'm a skeptic because I'm all the time vetting technologies. So I'm looking at hundreds of innovations every year and trying to figure out which ones are the most promising. So I have to be a skeptic. I have to start analyzing them. But at the same time, I have to figure out commercialization pathways for them as well. So we have to get creative about how this can navigate that complex healthcare pathway and get to the market and make an impact. So you do have to be an optimist as well. So that is me in a nutshell. So let's talk a little bit about, so this topic was health tech, med tech, biotech. So for people who are new to this, just a quick introduction on what we mean by all that. It's a very, very wide spectrum and it's growing by the day. So health tech is basically anything that's used for delivery, consumption, or payment. So these are all rough definitions. There's no one definition of anything. But the way that I like to define health tech is that there's usually an element of software, and the software is the one doing the job. And let's move to Medtech. That's the one in the middle. I think the slides got switched a little bit. So Medtech is devices that diagnose or treat disease. So anything physical, right? So any widget like a surgical tool or a glucose monitor, which you can see there, those would all fall under devices and those would fall under medtech. And nowadays you have this big, spectrum of wearables that are also collecting data. But the wearable is the core, and then there's the software on top of it. So sometimes there is software on top of a medtech device as well. But typically, if it's just software, then I like to put it under the health tech bucket. So the last one is biotech, which basically broadly is all sorts of therapeutics, and that includes small molecules and biologics, vaccines or biologics as well, antibodies, tissue-based therapies, vaccines would fall under that. So all that is biotech. So a lot of it can be thought about as modifying chemistry and biology. That's typically how I like to think about it. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about a small case study of a company in healthcare. So this company, it was called Home Hero. And what they were, it was a tech-enabled marketplace to match seniors up with caregivers. So the entrepreneur, the CEO of the company, he thought there was a huge problem here, and he was right? Because when people fall sick, when they get old, they do need those caregivers to be matched up with them. So it was some sort of e-harmony for seniors to find their caregivers. So think of it like that. So the technology was amazing. They were doing really well. But what happened, and the market, of course, you all know, senior care is a huge market. But what happened was suddenly there was a policy change where all the caregivers were designated as workers, which means they had to have W-2s and, all the tax implications associated with that. So suddenly the company kind of tanked because they could not deal with those costs, which came from the policy change. So nothing to do with the product, nothing to do with the market, just a policy change. That's what happened to them. So they had to pivot a little bit, and they had to start selling to a completely different entity. So instead of selling to people, consumers, they started selling to the enterprise. So they started selling to healthcare systems and payers, people who want those seniors to stay healthy because they will bear the costs for them in the near term. So the idea was, when people get discharged from a hospital, they need a caregiver. So my company will match you with that caregiver. And yes, the payer is very interested because the payer does not want the patient to come back to the hospital with a readmission, and that would lead to a pretty high cost for that patient. So that was okay. But the problem was they quickly realized that was okay only for the near term, right? So most payers and most healthcare systems only cared up until the 90-day mark when they are penalized for people coming back. So anything beyond that, nobody cared. They were like, why should we pay for this? It's the people that should pay for this. So again, they butted heads against that. They did some pilots with healthcare organizations, but very quickly realized that pilots don't translate into contracts. That's a common problem in healthcare. And then they just quit everything. They decided this is not worth doing, and they rebranded themselves as a telemedicine company, and that's it. That's the end of the story. So now you might say, are large companies any better? This was a very, very small company. So probably it was a venture-backed company, by the way, but it was still small. But what about large companies? But they don't do much better either. As you all know, Microsoft had these big dreams of us being able to look at all our healthcare data in one place. But, in 2019, they actually gave up. They said, we are not doing this consumer stuff anymore. And right now, all they are doing is competing with Amazon AWS. That's what Microsoft does in healthcare right now. So some of you are saying, what the hell? We came here to listen to exciting stuff, right? All that, cool stuff in healthcare. So why are we talking about all these problems? So a couple of reasons. So number one is that there are many opportunities hidden in these problems. So for many of you who are entrepreneurs, you do need to start with those problems and start saying, where's the opportunity for me to make a difference or to change that? So that's number one. And number two is, if you do anything in healthcare without understanding these deep problems, there's a high likelihood that you may have the same trajectory as Home Hero, right? So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that everybody here, if you're enthusiastic and passionate about doing something in healthcare, we want to get you started on that journey of understanding you are going to butt heads against several things in healthcare, but it's of course worth it. But let's kind of talk a little bit about that. So what, according to me, these are the four main things. There are 100 other things in healthcare that are problematic. And we are not necessarily today talking about what's problematic in healthcare. You all know everything is wrong with healthcare, right? But what we are talking about is what's problematic for innovators in healthcare, right? So this is not, today's thing is not about what's wrong with healthcare, like I said. So according to me, these are four main things. There are many other things. So let's start with the first one. The slides won't advance. Yeah, you can, yeah, so this is all about complex healthcare systems and complex biology. We can go to the next slide. So complex healthcare systems, as you all know, it's not when you say provider can mean a lot of things. There are various different types of providers. They come in all shapes and sizes, and their priorities are very different from what we typically think they are. We think that these providers want to be very innovative and they are in love with technology and they want to go and change the world with technology, but not really. They are grappling with some really basic issues like labor shortages and attrition and clinicians constantly complaining about burnout. And of course, the policy landscape and the payer landscape is changing so fast for these healthcare systems that they spend a significant amount of time and resources just dealing with that paperwork of like making sure they get paid on time, right? So that's something that they are all the time, they're worried about. So question is, of all these problems that they actually have and they care about, what can entrepreneurs fix? Rather than us telling them, hey, I have this exciting innovation. Do you want to be more innovative? Then yes, you should do this, because usually they don't care. The other problem with regards to healthcare systems, and those of you in healthcare know this really well, all the EHR systems, right? So you haven't heard anybody in healthcare that doesn't complain about EHRs, electronic healthcare records. So apparently doctors spend more than 75% of their time doing clinical documentation versus offering care to patients. So you can imagine how bad of a problem that is. And the problem is this whole system, it doesn't enable better care. It only enables better billing and payments. So that is the core problem with these health records. Things are getting better for innovators because companies are coming up with better ways to integrate their technologies into these healthcare record systems. So yes, things are getting better. So I'm a little bit optimistic, but the question is there a will on behalf of these providers and these, electronic health records companies to enable that integration, right? Because they want people to buy their products. They don't want them to buy competing products. Providers want patients to stay with them. They don't want patients to go to other competing providers. And in fact, there's a word for that in healthcare. It's called leakage. Leakage means that your patient starts seeing some other provider. So question is, do healthcare providers really want that integration, and do they want all those records to be visible in one place? Okay, so the other problem in healthcare is that you may be the beneficiary as a patient, but there are so many other people who are making those decisions and who are responsible for making sure that you benefit, right? So first it's the patient, and then it's the doctor, the clinician that's using the technology, and they are the end user. Let's think about a surgical robot, for example. It's not the patient who uses the robot, it's the doctor who does that. And then there is the buyer's decision maker. It's typically not the doctor, right? Like a doctor doesn't decide to buy a surgical robot. They are like millions of dollars. So it's the hospital system that decides to buy it, which means that's another layer. And that's, again, like getting through that is pretty complex. And then the payer, in some cases, like, for example, if you have a diagnostic test, like many of our PCR tests, for example, they were reimbursed by a payer. So a doctor prescribed a test to us, we benefited from it, but a payer paid for it. And then lastly, in many cases, the payer is just an administrator. It's really the federal government through Medicare, Medicaid, or our employer who's really footing the bill. So it gets extremely complex of like who's benefiting, who's paying, and it's different for every product. Lastly, under this category, human psychology and human biology, both are extremely complex. It's really hard to develop cures for anything. As people know, we were just talking earlier during the networking session about developing a cure for sickle cell anemia. But that probably took 50 years, right, to do that. A lot of trial and error. And then, of course, testing those cures just as difficult because you have to find human subjects to be able to test those. And that's, again, very complex. You have to be able to leverage healthcare data to make decisions. But the problem with healthcare data is that people get all excited about data, but the problem is data is very, very messy in healthcare. Most of it is unstructured. It's not as easy as taking an Excel sheet and running some numbers and coming up with answers. A lot of it is extremely unstructured. So we are making a lot of progress because of technologies like natural language processing, but we are still very, very early, right? We haven't made a whole lot of progress. And by progress, I mean actual difference to the way care is delivered every day, right? So I will believe it when care starts changing, because right now, yes, data is being leveraged for a lot of things, including clinical trial recruitment, including risk calculation, several things, but how is it actually impacting patient care? So that's another thing. Providers, very, very reluctant to change their workflows. In fact, providers sometimes tell us, if this adds 5 minutes to my schedule, then I don't think I will use this because I will have to do this 10 times a day and I don't have 50 minutes in my day. Most of them actually stay back to do their EHRs, right? So they don't have the time to change their workflows. Making people do what is best for them, it's a age-old problem, right? It's great to exercise, but how many people actually exercise? It's great to take your medication regularly, but we know, like those of us who have old parents, we know that it's really, really hard to get them to even take their medication. It's right there, it's sitting there, but they don't want to take it, right? So even that is hard. And people typically, we love to think about healthcare because we are in healthcare, but people who are not in healthcare, they hate to think about it. Healthcare is just not a pleasurable thing to think about because we want to just avoid going to the hospital. We want to avoid thinking that we are sick. So that's a huge problem as well. So typically we think about what show do I want to watch or what something that I want to buy, like a consumer product. But we are not sitting here and thinking every day, what health app should I download? Like people are not very excited about that. The next big component or category is the regulatory environment and policy. So getting past all the regulation is a huge challenge for most healthcare entrepreneurs. So the FDA, of course, is the elephant in the room. If your product is regulated by the FDA, then that does add usually millions of dollars to development and testing. So that's, and if it's a drug, then it might add $1 billion, right? So that's how bad it is. And not that it's bad, the FDA cares about risk. It cares about patient safety, and that's what they are doing this for. But unfortunately, in the process, it adds to a lot of the bureaucracy and the time to get something to market. And then, of course, we have the famous HIPAA regulations in health tech. So those of you who deal with healthcare data obviously deal with that a lot. And any useful healthcare data nowadays, it is, you will be violating HIPAA if you misuse it. So a lot of data is available out there, but the ones that the data is not regulated, it's probably not very useful because everybody has access to it. So that's the problem. So you don't have any competitive advantage if you have data that's freely available. So policy changes all the time in healthcare. So that's another problem. So we just talked about the startup where, a small regulation where the way employees are treated for tax purposes, that made them pivot their business models. So it's really hard that way with policy because it's completely unpredictable, sometimes comes out of nowhere. So for example, 4 or 5 years ago, there were many pricing transparency companies trying to make a mark. So their whole idea was, we will tell you what something costs, and nobody cared because people were like, yeah, who cares? Like, about pricing transparency, patients don't pay for anything anyway, it's the payers and blah, blah, blah. But now suddenly with the policy changes, there is a requirement that hospitals publish their prices, and that has created both tailwinds and headwinds for people. So there are some consultants who have taken advantage of that and gone and sold their services to hospitals to do two things. Of course, do it the right way, but also do it in such a way that people don't benefit from it at all, and the hospital can claim that they were compliant with that policy, right? So again, like, lots of those things happening in healthcare as well. So let's move to how you get paid. So typically in healthcare, there are 3 ways that you can get paid for your innovation. One, just directly go to the consumer, like whoever is using your product pays for it, right? So that's very simple. Some apps have that model. And then of course, like now it has become very popular with the COVID tests, right? So we buy those rapid COVID tests and we pay like $20 for them, and we don't bat an eyelid. We do that all the time. But that's not very common in healthcare. Most of healthcare, either a payer pays for it or a hospital is purchasing it. So it happens one of those 2 ways. And when you say payers, it typically means insurance companies, but it actually means more than that, because it also means, like, if you look at that pie chart, you can see that about half of healthcare, actually the costs are borne by your employers, right? So employers are actually the true payers, and then quarter of the costs are borne by the federal government, so Medicare, Medicaid. So that's kind of the payer mix. The private payers, because all they are doing is they are just processing transactions on behalf of all these people. So for example, an employer does not want to run an insurance company. So they contract out to United Health to run their payer system. So even though United Health might be your insurance company, your healthcare costs may be borne by your employer. So that's typically how it works in healthcare. Now the question is, who benefits by paying, right? So when a claim is submitted, when a procedure is done, when a claim is submitted, why would a payer say yes to a claim? So typically, if it's essential, yes, they would say yes, right? That's a no-brainer, like, procedures that are very common and they are necessary. But wherever there are gray areas, as in there is innovation, there is something new that is unproven, the benefits are still not out there, they hesitate quite a bit. So both Medicare and Medicaid, they are different as well. But typically Medicare is a little bit more innovative because it's care for seniors, and they know that even if they push healthcare costs down, they will still be on the hook for it, right? Because if a person like at 65, they don't take care of their health and they deny reimbursement for a product that could have helped prevent, let's say, a heart attack, maybe 10 years later, it will be Medicare that will be paying for that heart attack as well. Whereas that problem, I mean, there is a problem with other folks, right? Because we constantly like switch jobs and there are insurance changes, our employers change. So Medicaid is like that as well. People go on and off of Medicaid. So there is no constant, one payer that pays for our health. So there is a hesitation among payers to pay for most innovative things. So they try to push back as much as possible. We have purchasing decisions. So like I talked about, hospitals, healthcare facilities, small clinics, they're all making decisions to purchase products and use them. So lots of stakeholders, you can get lost in that whole system because you're talking to somebody for a year and then you realize they are not the decision maker. And then you have to start talking to another person and build a relationship. And then they use all these complex value analysis models. And those value analysis models are different for every facility, right? So it's not like one standard thing where you can plug in your numbers and get the answer. So that's a huge problem as well. There are many, many middlemen in healthcare. So if you're a drug, you have to work with pharmacy benefit managers. If you're a device, you have to usually sell to GPOs, which are group purchasing organizations, and they all take their cut and they all have their own priorities as well as to how they decide whether to buy your product. And then lastly, pilots don't translate into contracts, which we already talked about. So the last thing I want to talk about is all those misaligned incentives as well. So we have all these different categories, but nobody in healthcare acts like you would expect them to. So that's very, very unfortunate. So let's think about this a little bit. Are payers really incentivized to lower costs? Usually not, because there is a rule that payers can actually only make, typically they can only make a profit of 20%, they have to spend 80% on your healthcare. So the only way that they can grow revenue is by growing the top line. So they have to grow how much is spent on healthcare so that they can get 20% of it, right? It sounds really weird, and I'm oversimplifying this a lot, but unfortunately, that's how it works in healthcare. So providers, are they incentivized to do what is best for the patient? So you might think so, but typically, like just take the example of surgical robots, right? We still don't know if the benefits outweigh the costs. We still don't know that. But certain doctors obviously feel like it's a status thing, or if I don't use a robot, then the patient might go to some other surgeon. So there are a lot of factors that play into how a provider makes a decision, and not all of it is based on just direct patient benefit. Are policymakers incentivized? Because if you were the president of the US, like, why would you do something that wouldn't benefit consumers? But again, it's not very straightforward. So we know, I think many of you might be following this. There's a bill which is talking about drug pricing. And if you just follow the story of that bill, you will realize that things are not as easy as they seem. We all know that drug pricing needs to be fixed, right? But it is an issue that they have been fighting about for a long time. And you should read the arguments on both sides to understand that it's not as simple. It's not as easy as saying, sure, let's go ahead and pass this bill and lower drug costs, right? So that's another issue as well. Then are innovators, so are we incentivized to solve real problems? So theoretically, yes, we should be incentivized to solve real problems, but the problem is we are forced to follow the money. So a lot of times we have to build things in such a way that our business models are right and the way that we make money is right, because we can't just build a great product and expect people to buy it. And that's the unfortunate part about innovators, right? So we have to get very creative about payment systems and, the way it's structured, the way the service is delivered, how it's sold. So a lot of times we focus on all that, and the patient becomes the last thing that you think about. So that's another problem. And then the last one, we just talked about that already. Patients themselves are not very incentivized to do what's best for them, right? So this makes things pretty messed up. So innovators have a huge balancing act. They are dealing with this web of stakeholders, each with different incentives, which don't match up. So then why should we bother? Like, why should we even innovate in healthcare? So this was like all very, very negative, right? It's like everything is wrong with healthcare. So why should we do anything at all? So number one, there is a huge opportunity. The percentage of GDP that we are spending on healthcare is growing by the year, right? So there is no other industry which is growing at the pace of healthcare. So if you want something where if you are successful, it will grow, you are guaranteed to find that in healthcare. There is a huge opportunity. And there are a ton of problems as well, because there are no cures for most conditions. We are treating them symptomatically. So go out there and invent new things, new products to solve those problems. There is a need because the healthcare system is messed up, and we need people who are passionate to solve those problems. So definitely a need as well. And last thing is the meaning that you get by working in healthcare. So most of you are like, I see many of you here who are in the healthcare industry, and you're not here just because you wanted to make money. It's because you find some purpose by working in healthcare, because that leads to impact. So definitely a huge, huge element of why people should be in healthcare. So yes, we need you. We need entrepreneurs. So hopefully you're up to the challenge. So I said a lot of things that were not very positive. So I'm hoping that Scott can get us excited about healthcare innovation.
Thank you, Nishi. Let's see. So I'm going to start off with the slide that I brought up. Last time I spoke here was in February of 2020, right when COVID was starting to be out there and people were starting to understand a little bit about it. But one of the things that's been a challenge here in the US back then, and it continues now, is the cost of healthcare and the quality of healthcare. The chart is a little bit small, but over on the left, the vertical axis is the number of years people on average will live in various countries. And on the right is the cost per capita of that healthcare for that person in that country. And you'll see a bunch of the gray lines going up. That's the number of countries throughout the world. The red line at the bottom going way to the right is the US. So our life expectancy before COVID was lower than a lot of the other industrialized countries, yet the cost was higher. Why is that? We generate the best healthcare innovation in the world, but our deployment of healthcare is lagging, and we're doing something wrong about that. The healthcare industry is 18% of GDP, and that may not even include some of the healthcare going to government and military. So it's actually probably a little bit higher than that. So with putting so much money into it, why are we not getting the quality out of it some other countries do? That's a debate for another meeting. But I do think it's important to understand that we generate the best healthcare innovation in the world, yet over on the right, recent numbers show that the US is 46 of the top industrialized countries in life expectancy. We can do a lot better, and we should. We do some things right. So this graph is showing the number of people who die per 100,000 of cancer. And that number is steadily going down. We're doing a better job with that. A lot of that innovation comes from here. A lot of it comes internationally as well, but we are doing better in that space. Unfortunately, these treatments being new and so forth are very, very high cost. And that's adding to some of the healthcare costs. Now, one of the challenges, just to take a slight tangent, one of the challenges that we have is if we start regulating healthcare and the reimbursement, we're not going to get the investment in healthcare that's going to carry it to the finish line with new products and new solutions. So how do we balance that as well? So Austin, what can we do in this town? We're not known, or historically have not been known as a huge biotech hub, yet we're starting to get recognition. The latest poll that I can find in 2020 shows that Austin is the third fastest growing biotech hub in the US. We're not the biggest, but we're one of the fastest growing based on our size and based on our output. Austin has about 300 companies in biotech or health tech space. There are research parks planned to help accelerate this as well in the Austin community area. And we have 20 colleges or universities that have degrees or offerings in biotech or in health. And Dell Medical School has not always been around here. It's come out in the past decade. And Austin was the biggest metro area in the US that did not have a medical center, a medical school. We have it now, and it's helping a lot. There are a number of entities that work in health tech and biotech in Austin that are gaining momentum, shown on the right. And this map that's inserted at the bottom kind of shows where a lot of the biotech companies were a few years ago. You'll see they're spread throughout town. We don't really have a hub like a Kendall Square or anything here in that area. And that's one of the reasons the group I work with, Bio Austin, we really try to get people together to collaborate and create that water cooler effect, not unlike the Austin Forum. So I've got a couple of questions here, basically what if. So what if we change healthcare from a break fix scenario, which it is now? So the way healthcare and you engage in healthcare nowadays is you get broken. Something is wrong with you. You have a cold, you have a pain. You then become a patient. You go to healthcare. Hopefully they fix you. More likely they sustain the injury and make it not as bad. And then at the very end, you find out what the cost is. And this is true whether or not you have insurance. So we don't really know the cost until the end of the loop. And that's unlike just about anything else that we would accept in a market economy. But what if we move to more of a preventative space to where we don't become sick, we don't become broke, we stay healthy? That's better. But one of the things that I've been doing a lot more recently is looking not only to where the technology could take us in the near term, but in the long term. What are the next areas we go to, and can we leapfrog to those? With that's enhanced health. How do we keep ourselves better fit, better mobile, better feeling, living longer, and so forth? So we never become a patient, we stay ahead of the curve and actually maybe enhance our abilities. What if we go from very simple areas like antique scheduling? Right now, in very recent interactions with healthcare myself, you call in to schedule an appointment. You wait for them to call you back. You're probably in a meeting when they call back, and then you look at your schedule. You schedule a time to even go in and engage healthcare. Some of the groups have web-based scheduling now, and typically what that involves is you go in and you say, I would like to have an appointment on this day. They then call you back and talk to you and schedule the appointment. And there is some complexity that they think requires that. For instance, you may need a longer appointment or something like that. There is technology that can solve all of that. And this is actually an interesting, very low-hanging fruit area of applying AI to understanding more of what type of schedule that we need to do, and we can replace the receptionist in that space. But what if we move to on demand? I have a question, I have a concern. I just call up healthcare, or I go pull my app up and figure out the answer to my question. We started seeing that accelerate a lot under COVID, and that's been a very good thing, I think, with telehealth and some of the other on-demand health services that are available. This is a complex area. A lot of the companies did well in COVID. A lot of them are going bankrupt now because that revenue may or may not continue. So we need to learn and capture what happened there and apply it towards the future, I think. Healthcare should be convenient. There's no reason it shouldn't be. We're not used to expecting that, but healthcare should compete for our attention. And I think we can go a long way there. Healthcare is convoluted, it's entrenched, it's as big as the government pretty much. There's a lot of politics in healthcare. There's a lot of ways that we've done it, and it's very hard to change those ways. On the other side, the people that you talk to on the front lines, these guys are overburdened. Burnout rate in healthcare is about 50%. A lot of people are not satisfied with their job. And as Nishi mentioned, a lot of times it's related to that record keeping that we keep. Jumping into the records real quick, one of the things that we're doing in records still to this date is we're tracking what we're charging for. We're not tracking necessarily the results or the outcome, but we're tracking what we're charging for. So what good is that? How do we make the system better with that? If we go from healthcare the way it is now to more of a market economy, which healthcare is not. In the United States of America, healthcare is far from a market economy. There's no competition in it. You don't know what the cost is. You don't know the quality. If we move more to a market economy to where there could be competition within it, so we could become better as we go, we can go a long way. One of the political debates in healthcare, which is justified, is, who gets covered and who pays for it. But those things are looking at a problem so far down the track of our list of problems we ought to solve, it should be obsoleted. One of the things we ought to do is be looking at lowering the cost for the patient on a per incident basis and increasing our ability to cover and make people better. If we lower the cost and increase the outcomes, then both of the political solutions get solved for less money, for more coverage. And we ought to be looking at things like that instead of creating issues to just suit a political agenda. I'm dissatisfied with both parties, by the way. So the solution should always be patient-centric. I was at a presentation once from one of the people that was working with Obama to set the incentives for electronic health records. And he said in the presentation, who knew that we should have made health records patient-centric? Well, I knew that back then, and I went and challenged him, and he knew it back then as well. But the political expediency of it did not allow that to happen. However, everyone knows now that the records and everything about health should be patient-centric. That's why we're doing it. And if we take that approach, kind of wrapping around that, we could show where Austin, I think, could have a big impact on this. So in Austin, the biotech companies, the 300 that we have, are spread out in all areas. We have from pharma to devices to health IT to CROs to diagnostics. We're really all over the place. And I think that actually gives us an advantage. We have talent to bring from many areas. We can look at things different. We're not entrenched in the way we do things here. And we could take that knowledge and apply it differently to really solve things in healthcare. We have some of the best entrepreneurs in the world here. We think differently, and we can actually approach things without that baggage that a lot of people are doing. We have great programming talent. I think software is going to be involved with pretty much any technology that comes to health in the future. If nothing else, in a way to track it and to understand if we are actually getting the outcome that. And we have a creative culture. I mentioned that earlier, and we're not constrained. So, to change the presentation around, Nishi.
Thank you, Scott. And don't worry, I'm not going to say anything negative anymore, right? It's going to be all exciting stuff. So Scott and I thought, after talking to you all about healthcare, let's talk about a couple of examples that we like. So of course, I love therapeutics because they are life-saving in many cases. So I'm not specifically mentioning them because, you know, it's a no-brainer that you should invent drugs for diseases that are currently like uncurable, right? So that's like, so I didn't mention any drugs. And then of course, again, like devices which are life-saving or diagnose disease, like obviously those are pretty obvious. So I just picked a couple that I thought, you know, made sense for this audience, given that it's definitely a bit more tech leaning. So let's talk about AI. So we never brought AI up in this conversation today, but let's talk a little bit about it. So I do believe that it's very useful when it, at least for now, right, in the stage that we are at right now. And I'm sure it can do a lot of miracles in the future, but for where we are right now, it would be great if we could apply it to automate tasks that currently take clinicians a long time. So we did speak a little bit about clinical documentation, and this is exactly that. So let's start all the way from let's say a patient is at the doctor's clinic, their voice gets automatically transcribed into the right fields into the EHR so that the doctor doesn't have to deal with various different drop downs. Like nowadays, when you go to the doctor, you might notice that the doctor is not even looking at you. They are more focused on typing things into an EHR or selecting from drop downs. And they're asking you sometimes a few stupid questions because that's what the drop downs are asking them to select. So sometimes that happens as well. But this is a smart way to do that in the sense that you're applying some type of natural language processing to figure out where each data point should go and doing that automatically. So what if we could do that? Then the next step would be to start combining all that. So what the patient said, what was the result of a diagnostic test? What did the X-ray look like? What did the MRI look like? And come up with a differential diagnosis on its own, right? So that's also the power of AI. So we could do that. And it could actually spit out for all that the patient has. And of course, history is a really, really important thing for patients. Like when I was trained in medicine, we were told that 80% or even more of the diagnosis comes from just talking to the patient about their history. And AI can definitely diagnose by looking at previous history because it can read much faster than human beings, of course. So you can come up with differential diagnosis. You can also come up with a list of medications that might be novel, things like that. So it could make some recommendations about for this patient, for everything that they have, and given the side effects that they may potentially have, these are the medications that are appropriate for this particular patient. So we've been talking about personalized medicine for a very long time now. So AI can hopefully make some of that work. And of course, AI can help you predict the risk of somebody getting readmitted. So AI can actually figure out if there is a chance of this particular patient that you're discharging today, is there a chance that they will come back, let's say with heart failure in 10 days, because maybe they didn't eat right, or maybe they didn't take their medication right. So there are a lot of factors that you can analyze to figure those things out. And then you would stay on top of things. You would probably give the patient a wearable to track them, and you could take various measures, or you could call them every day, because it's worth it in healthcare. Because every time a patient gets readmitted, sometimes the costs for that system are like $30,000 or even more sometimes, right? So that's just 30,000 is like for one particular type of procedure. And the last thing is automated coding, because that's one more thing doctors are frustrated about, because they think that they have become glorified coders because they have all those drop downs. What they're trying to do is the EHR is trying to get the doctor to enter data in a structured way so that it can be coded right. And the EHR also wants to make sure that everything that should be coded is coded. So that's the other thing as well, because if you don't code something, you don't get paid for it, right? So that's another issue in healthcare. So if we could solve that by not having the doctor do that at all, and that happening automatically, that would be a huge blessing. So all this is automation. So let's go to this company. I talk about them quite a lot. And there are many more companies like this nowadays, but you all may have seen ads for this company. They basically have coupons for drugs, right? So when you have a prescription medication, you can actually go to their website and start looking at some pricing comparisons. And it actually is more helpful for patients who don't have health insurance. That's where I like them a lot, because what they have managed to do, and that's why I say leverage current ecosystem. So they are not trying to change the world or anything like that. What they are doing is they are using a contracted price from a middleman, and they're using that to provide that same price for an uninsured person as well. So as long as you have the coupon, you will get the price that somebody who's insured gets. So that's amazing, right? So things like that, those are great innovations where you don't butt heads against the system. You're just trying to figure out, how do I navigate my way around where things are right now and still help patients at the same time? So that's one reason why I like them a lot. And my last one is some type of digital front door for health. So we have all become pretty used to telemedicine right now. We do feel comfortable seeing our doctor online, but this is a little bit different. I would definitely encourage you to take a look at this product. It's called Buoy Health, BUOY Health. So you can Google that. And anytime you're dealing with any type of condition, right? Like, oh, I have back pain and nausea. So let's say you're dealing with that. You could actually go to the symptom checker and type all that in, and it actually gives you a pretty smart differential diagnosis. So as a clinician, I have used this tool many times, and I have always been impressed. And the way they work is they ask you a bunch of questions, right? So they ask you, okay, what's your age? And if you have nausea, then do you also have vomiting? And it will keep asking you a lot of those questions that your doctor would ask. And then it comes up with those diagnoses. So some of the things that they come up with are actually treatable at home, or they are treatable by a PCP. So you don't need to go to a specialist. So why I think they are valuable is, one, self-care, because that's huge. Like if you were able to understand that this is not a big deal, I don't have to really go to urgent care or the ER right now to solve this problem, that's great. But also, it frees up other health resources as well, right? So if you use a tool like this, and if you are then directed to, let's say the tool tells you all you need right now is a telemedicine visit, you don't need to go to the ER, it frees up the person in the ER to take care of somebody who actually has an emergency. So healthcare is also dealing with those issues. Remember, we talked about labor shortages and clinician burnout and all that. So tools like this, they help solve that problem in a little bit of an indirect way. So yeah, that's what I had. I'll turn over to Scott.
So I've kind of come up with an innovation checklist that would help, I think, drive a lot of biotech companies in the right direction. One of the things, again, everything needs to be patient-centric. It should be accessible to as many people as possible, as easily as possible. There's no reason for healthcare to be painful when it doesn't need to be. It is right now in a lot of cases. It should be trackable. We should always learn if we're getting better with the procedures or getting worse, so we can intervene on that. There should be good communications, and this is a great place for technology, so that we could take the technology and allow the patient themselves, the caregiver, the family to understand better how people are progressing. It could be then become a community event if needed. One of the examples of this that I was involved with companies in early on is in the diabetes space. A kid has diabetes, they're taking their insulin. Are they really doing it? As a parent, you might be very concerned with it. Apps could give that information to them so there could be peace of mind. It's also used a lot in elderly, allowing people to stay independent longer, to where the caregivers, often the children, can be more comfortable with that decision. Good for everybody. It must be effective. Again, we need to track this effectiveness. The cost should be known. So Nishi mentioned GoodRx, and diving into that a little bit more, it's often the case that even if you're insured, if you go pay your copay for a drug, that copay may be higher than the pharmacy is reimbursed for that drug. The contracts in healthcare are very interesting in that people that pay cash often pay the most for healthcare. And I think this is a sin. I think it's wrong. It's why it's not a market economy. GoodRx takes care of that and basically brings those purchasing prices, the contracted ones, to the patient or whoever is going in and using it. It also sometimes works if you have insurance. You might get a better price on that, by the way. Trust. Trust is an interesting thing. Trust has been challenged in a lot of ways in recent years. And, who do you believe for your health information? This is something that is way beyond this, but it's something that should be baked into a solution whenever possible. It should be easy to find. You find the healthcare. Do you go to your primary care physician, or is there an easier way? One of the ways, healthcare is large and bureaucratic, like I mentioned. One of the ways that we can fix it, instead of fixing it, is to compete with it and force them to come over and compete with us. Kind of the beacon on the hill strategy, to where we do something so much better that people will come to us. And I think that has a lot of opportunity. In a lot of areas in health, the cost might be lower than $25. When we're able to get below the $25 price point, we're often lower than the copay. So we can create a cash economy, not deal with all the reimbursement and all the paperwork and bureaucracy of that, and provide better health more often. It must be compatible with the existing system. So to get in healthcare, there are a lot of gatekeepers. There's a lot of complexity. If you do a healthcare company or a health tech company, make sure you have someone on the team or an advisor that understands that complexity, and don't be scared by what they say, but understand it and know it. And competition, I think, brings the best and the brightest to the top. So really with all of this, these are some of the things that we can look at to kind of assess and judge a company or a startup idea. And I look forward to conversations later.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Nishi. All right, we're right back on schedule, so we've got time for questions. So Scott, don't go anywhere. So Scott, come up here, and Nishi, please come up here as well. And for the Q&A moderator, I'm pleased to bring from the back, where she's been running text and moderating the online part, to the front, Allison Warner, former managing director of the Austin Forum on Technology and Society. She'll pick some questions from the Slack channel, saving one for the winning badge question.
Hi. Okay. I have a couple of good questions here. Enrique Lin Xiao. Did I say that right? Okay. What concerns do you have around data security in the context of personalized medicine and innovative devices collecting personal health data?
I'll take this first. One of the things with health and why the data collection and the privacy matters so much is that information could be used against us. The insurers, if they have that information, they can charge us higher rates and things like that. So there is a cost of that data breach, not just embarrassment and things like that. It's very important. It's also very doable. So data, if you put data integrity into the design of what you're doing, it's actually not a hard problem to solve. It's when that data then is exchanged with someone else that it becomes a little more difficult.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. But I just want to add that in some ways that's already happening. So our health records are actually the least of the important, pieces of what they need, because those, like I was saying earlier, a lot of the data is unstructured, hard to read, but lot of us are Googling things like, oh, I have like, maybe a chance of, like, for example, my mammogram came positive, right? So what next? So imagine if you have Googled that, both Google and a lot of other companies that are tracking your data, they already know that you have some risk of developing breast cancer because your mammogram was positive. So there is a lot of data already being vacuumed up by these companies. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but then I would add what Scott said as well. And slowly, one more thing, we are also coming to innovations that are going to help patients benefit from sharing their data. So that's coming as well. So there are some blockchain-based technologies that are going to help monetize your own healthcare data. So that's coming up.
Okay. From Steve Krant, the patient population often most in need of complex healthcare, for example, seniors, are also the least tech savvy, least able to access the internet, et cetera. How does a market-based healthcare system reconcile and address those needs?
Yeah, so just take an example of Walmart Health. So they haven't done that much. So I'm a little kind of hesitant to talk a lot about them, but at least the way they are thinking about it is all the pricing will be completely transparent. So it'll be almost like walking into a fast food restaurant, knowing how much exactly something costs. So that's kind of how they want to do it. Now, they haven't been able to do that. So in fact, we are already hearing that that model isn't working very well because it's really hard to tell what the price of something is. And we are like, oh yeah, we could have told you this like 10 years ago, right? They didn't have to do all this to figure that out. But those types of models where things are a little bit more transparent. So you don't have to be tech savvy. You can actually walk in and say, this visit costs $50. And if I have a diagnostic test, then it'll be $50 more. So that's a simplistic way of putting it. The problem in healthcare is that everything is a little bit unpredictable, right? So when you walk into a clinic with back pain, it might be nothing, or it might be a herniated disc for which you might need surgery. So who knows? So yeah, there is a simplistic way of thinking about it, but then healthcare is pretty complex.
Two things real quick. She mentioned Walmart, and I think it's an interesting story. Walmart looked at it and realized that 99% of the US population visits a Walmart at least once a year. So because of that, they're looking at putting clinics within the Walmarts to make it to increase access. And I think those plans got changed a little bit based on the reaction of COVID and the on-demand help that's available. But as far as technology and seniors, one of the things that technology, an extra technology could do to make that easier is using things like Alexa to talk to the seniors and allow them to step through situations and maybe reach out and meet a physician or a caretaker through voice.
I think Alexa is awesome, but older generations tend to still have issues with, oh, I don't want to mess with that. I mean, I can't imagine my grandmother being like, oh, Alexa, tell me about my back pain. Because I mean, she'd just be like, I don't know how to do that. So how do you get past that?
Maybe so. I've seen some people that were
Again,
technology averse. Yeah, technology averse, embrace Alexa when someone set it up for them. But one thing Alexa is doing, they actually have some HIPAA compliant ways of talking through the app. So they're starting to deal with the data privacy and so forth, and something that's listening to you all the time.
So I did tell you all that I'm pretty opinionated in the beginning. So one thing that I believe is that we don't need a one size fits all. We don't need everybody to use telemedicine or health apps and all that stuff. We just need a part of the population to do that so that clinicians can focus on the other side of the population that does not have the ability to do that, right? So I think it's totally okay that, let's say, half the population is not tech savvy, because those of us who can reduce the burden on healthcare by benefiting from those technologies.
A good point. Okay, from Jason Scharf. What do you think about the recent renewed push by the major techs push into healthcare? Examples include Microsoft buying Nuance, Apple's watch becoming a med device with the heart rate, the pulse ox, the atrial fibrillation. Google's AlphaFold and hospital partnerships, Amazon buying PillPack, One Medical, and Oracle buying Cerner. That was a lot, sorry. Does this create opportunity, competition, or both? That's the real question.
Yeah, that was a very long question,
Yeah.
but then in the end, it did get to like the meat of it, right? So the question about why are they all going into healthcare? Remember my slide about opportunity, like it is the biggest opportunity. If you were looking to grow, why would you not go into healthcare, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Regarding competition, I think we have a long way to go because a lot of times these large tech companies, they take a long time to figure out healthcare and then people start reaping the benefits, right? So PillPack, for example, is a little different because they acquired something that already had a very good business model. It was already set in place and very simple, right? It just delivers drugs to people and it delivers them in a very convenient way for them to be able to take. So things like that, yes, I think it will increase competition. But things like, for example, Amazon taking over One Medical, it's going to take a while to make that integration happen. And for those of you who are more like curious about One Medical, I would encourage you to go and read the reviews of One Medical, right? It's whatever people are telling you about, oh, wow, it's the best thing in the world that's happening and all that. You do need to read real consumer reviews to figure out it's not all hunky-dory. It's a great model of delivering primary care and it's working pretty well, but there are a lot of kinks and those need to be figured out as well before we can claim that this is just going to solve all our problems and empower consumers and encourage competition and all sorts of things.
But again, it's that taking the easy stuff, the low hanging fruit off the plate of these super busy healthcare workers who need to attend to, correct? Am I right?
I think that is one huge value of One Medical because in some ways it's diverting people that can be diverted to that type of primary care, which is a little bit on the concierge primary care side. So, which is great because then those people get taken care of and then our healthcare system is freed up. In fact, the way One Medical makes money, it's actually not by selling to consumers. Most of their revenue actually comes by contracting with payers or contracting with employers, with health systems. So it's actually these business models in healthcare are really weird, right? So when we say competition, it's not the consumer that's making a decision on going to One Medical. It's being offered to them by their employer, and that's why they are going. So it's a little bit of a top-down approach, unfortunately.
And I'd just add like things like the atrial fibrillation on the Apple Watch. It's a neat gimmick, and it can be helpful to the certain people that might need that, but we really need a lot more functionality to allow it to really address healthcare. I think it's great that these organizations are trying these things and starting to integrate them. It's proving that there's a market for the new startups that might fit this space.
Okay. All right. And now for the winning question from Kiara Ortiz Cedeno. Yes. Are you here? All right. They're there. Many health professionals and engineers are from other parts of the world. However, it can be difficult for doctors, engineers, and other innovative people to work across country lines. It seems that greater international collaboration could accelerate biotech and medtech innovation. How might we achieve greater international cross collaboration?
There is a lot of international collaboration already in a lot of areas in health. But one of the ways that we can increase it is through communications and the data infrastructure that we have. A lot of health is tending to move to having a digital component, and this is going to make that easier. The question then becomes a lot of times around the IP and who owns what, and that's a complex situation. But yeah, there's room for everyone to be involved.
Yeah, especially low-cost devices, right? Low-cost innovation. So if you look at even countries like India, where I am from, obviously, so you have a lot of innovation going on there, which is trying to reduce the cost of something in healthcare. For example, an easy way to do an ultrasound in the field. So you can actually carry around a small box and do an ultrasound on a pregnant patient. So there are definitely, like Scott was saying, there are those innovations and there are collaborations, but sometimes they do get stuck in the whole, like, when they do try and translate to the US, the problem is they start butting heads against, the entrenched players, and then they don't move forward. But yes, that whole field is actually really, really promising. And we should do more of that, because those innovations, we keep saying we need to lower healthcare costs. How are we going to do that if we don't pull those innovations in and try and test them out here in the US, generate some good data and prove that maybe that ultrasound works just as well as our regular ultrasound machines? And if we don't do that, then yes, we will stay in status quo forever.
And one added thing, Nishi mentioned the FDA and the regulatory bodies in the US. Every country has their own regulatory bodies. But one thing, particularly with devices and some other areas in health tech, it's easier actually to deploy the solution, or quicker to deploy the solution in other countries before we do it here, just due to the time and cost.
Great. Thank you both very much. Let's give them another round of applause.